The biting wind, howling off the Bitterroot Mountains, carried the scent of iron and impending snow, but on the raised pine platform outside the Pine Creek livery, the atmosphere was choked with a far more suffocating tension. Hannah Thorne stood perfectly still as a drunken teamster lunged forward, grabbing her bare wrist to inspect her like livestock. Her pale eyes flashed, and with a swift, calculated twist, she slammed her heels into the frozen dirt, shoving the man backward into the cheering, merciless crowd. Silas Finch, the sweat-drenched county agent, slammed his wooden gavel onto the railing. "Settle down, folks. She's 19, strong-backed and utterly silent, a deaf mute who won't talk back. Who will start the bidding at $5 for the county's trouble." To the decent citizens of Pine Creek, Montana, the late autumn placement fair was a necessary cruelty. The territory was unforgiving, and when frost ruined the crops or fever claimed the breadwinners, those left behind were auctioned off to anyone willing to cover their county filing fees. The strong teenage boys were claimed first by cattlemen needing extra hands for the winter harvest. The healthy young women followed, taken in by overworked ranch wives, who required help with churning butter and mending denim. Now only Hannah remained. She stood remarkably straight, her pale blonde hair pulled into a tight, practical braid that whipped against the frayed collar of her thin cotton dress. Her skin was reddened by the sub-zero chill, and a faint tremor ran through her raw hands, which were clasped tightly in front of her waist. Yet she refused to bow her head. She tracked the shifting faces of the crowd with sharp, relentless intelligence. Though she could not hear their harsh muttering, she understood the shape of rejection. She had seen it enough times since the county had taken charge of her life. "Come now, folks," Silas Finch barked, wiping his brow with a soiled bandana despite the freezing draft. "Look at her frame. She can haul firewood, scrub floorboards, and tend livestock from dawn until dusk. $5. A heavy-set rancher near the front spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dust. $5 for a deaf woman. She's a liability, Finch. She can't hear a runaway wagon coming down the trail. She can't hear a dinner bell or a rattler in the hayloft. You ought to ship her back on the stage to Helena. I'll drop the fee to $3. Finch pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation as the sky turned the bruised purple color of iron. $3 for a full-grown working hand. The silence that followed was heavy and ugly. The townsfolk began to turn their collars up against the wind, shifting their weight to leave. It was always easier to walk away than to look directly at a human being nobody wanted. At the outer edge of the crowd stood Caleb Vance. At 44, Caleb was a man constructed of rough edges, quiet habits, and old calcified grief. He had driven his wagon into town from his secluded 300-acre homestead in the Upper Valley to gather winter provisions: 50 pounds of salt pork, a barrel of flour, and a new iron plowshare. He had absolutely no intention of taking home a human being. His log cabin had sat in silent isolation for 5 long years, ever since a sudden violent lung fever had taken his wife Sarah and their 7-year-old daughter Clara in the span of 48 hours. Caleb had buried them on a cold Tuesday beneath the roots of a yellow pine. Since that day, he had built a life out of absolute solitude. He spoke to his draft horses, he spoke to his hound, but he spoke to people only when commerce strictly required it. Yet, as Caleb watched the crowd turn its back on the girl, a cold, steady anger took root in his chest. He saw the way Hannah held her chin high, even as her body shivered uncontrollably in the mountain air. He recognized that quiet, stubborn defiance. It was the same look his late wife had carried when the dry summer of '77 had burned their first wheat crop to ash. Caleb felt a sharp, phantom ache in his ribs. He looked at the respectable men and women walking away, and the hypocrisy of the town rubbed against his soul like coarse sandpaper. He stepped forward. His heavy leather boots crunched loudly against the hardened earth. I'll pay the $2, Caleb said. His voice was deep gravelly from disuse, but it carried effortlessly across the yard. The crowd halted. Heads turned. Silas Finch blinked in shock before a massive, relieved grin split his red face. "Sold to Caleb Vance!" Finch shouted, scrambling to pull a ink-stained ledger from his satchel. "Step right up and sign the county ledger, Mr. Vance." Caleb walked up the wooden steps of the platform, ignoring the sudden venomous whispers that rippled through the onlookers. A 44-year-old widower taking an unmarried 19-year-old deaf woman to an isolated mountain cabin was bound to stir the tongues of Pine Creek. But Caleb did not care for their morality. He stood beside Hannah. Up close, he could see the faint violet shadows beneath her eyes and the sheer force of willpower keeping her upright. Hannah turned her head, assessing him with pale, guarded eyes. There was no gratitude in her expression, only intense, analytical observation. She weighed his worn sheepskin coat, his calloused hands, and the deep lines etched around his mouth. Caleb reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 worn silver dollars, and dropped them onto the ledger. He took the dip pen from Finch and signed his name in a thick, deliberate script, Ward Hannah Thorne. Fee paid in full. "She's your responsibility now, Vance," Finch muttered, snapping the book shut. "No returns once the snow hits the pass." Caleb put the pen down and turned to the young woman. He did not know how to speak to someone who lived in silence. Carefully, he raised his hand, pointed to himself, and then gestured toward his supply wagon parked outside the general store. Hannah followed his finger. She looked at the wagon, then back at Caleb's face. She picked up a small, frayed canvas sack from the floorboards, containing everything she owned in the world, and gave a single sharp nod. It was a cold, businesslike gesture. The 3-hour ride toward the Bitterroot Valley was choked with an uncomfortable silence. The wagon wheels rattled over frozen ruts as the wind howled through the ponderosa pines. Caleb held the leather reins, keeping his eyes fixed on the trail. Hannah sat bolt upright on the wooden bench beside him, staring straight ahead, refusing to huddle against him for warmth despite her thin dress. Caleb felt the weight of his impulsive decision settling over him like lead. He was entirely unequipped for this. His house contained no women's garments, no extra blankets, and no gentleness. He was taking a guarded, vulnerable young woman into the mouth of a brutal Montana winter. He glanced sideways at her. Her lips were turning a faint, alarming shade of blue. Without a word, Caleb wrapped the reins around the iron brake lever. He reached into the bed behind the seat, pulled out a heavy, well-oiled buffalo robe, and held it out to her. Hannah flinched. She shrank back against the wooden sideboard, raising her left arm in an instinctive defensive shield. Caleb froze. The motion was subtle, but it told him a terrifying story about the places she had been before Silas Finch put her on that auction block. It spoke of heavy hands and dark rooms. Slowly, deliberately, Caleb lowered the buffalo robe. He did not force it on her. Instead, he laid it gently across the empty wooden space between them on the bench, leaving it entirely within her reach. Then he took the reins back and stared at the horse's ears. 5 minutes passed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Caleb saw a pale, chapped hand reach out and slowly drag the heavy fur over her lap. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had plunged behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. The cabin was a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, but it looked utterly desolate against the vast white wilderness. Caleb set the brake and stepped down into the dirt. Hannah climbed down by herself, completely ignoring the hand he offered to steady her. She dropped her canvas bag onto the porch and stood motionless, staring at the thick oak door of the dark house. Caleb unlocked the door and pushed it open. The interior was freezing, smelling of cold ash and dried pine needles. He stepped inside, struck a match, and lit the kerosene lamp on the heavy kitchen table. The yellow glow chased the shadows into the corners, revealing a single large room, with a stone hearth, a loft above, and a small closed door off the main living space. That door had not been opened in 5 years. It was Clara's room. Caleb walked over his heavy boots, echoing on the floorboards. He reached out his hand, trembling slightly, and turned the iron latch. He pushed the door open. The small room contained only an iron bedstead, a rolled canvas mattress, and a dusty washstand. He turned around. Hannah was standing by the front entrance, holding her canvas sack against her chest like armor. Caleb pointed to her, then pointed inside the small bedroom. Hannah walked slowly to the threshold. She looked at the narrow bed, then looked back at Caleb. Her pale eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for the catch, the unspoken demand that usually came with a roof and a fire. When she found only a profound, exhausted grief in his eyes, her posture softened by a fraction of an inch. She walked into the room and gently pulled the door shut behind her. Caleb stood alone in the dark kitchen, listening to the absolute silence of his house. It was the same silence he had lived with for years. But as the first flakes of a massive winter storm began to tick softly against the glass window pane, he knew that the silence was about to break. The morning arrived in the Bitterroot Valley, with a pale, brittle light that bled through the ice-frosted window panes. Caleb Vance woke in his cold loft to the scent of burning pine and the faint, bitter aroma of dark coffee. He swung his legs over the edge of his bed, shivering as the freezing floorboards bit into his bare feet. He pulled on his heavy trousers and wool shirt, stepping quietly to the edge of the loft stairs. Down below the kitchen was already transformed. Hannah Thorne stood on an overturned wooden crate pulled up to the cast-iron cook stove, stirring a simmering pot of oats with a heavy wooden spoon. She wore Caleb's spare canvas apron wrapped twice around her narrow waist and tied tightly in a lopsided bow at her front. Her blonde hair was rebraided neat and practical, though her shoulders remained set in a rigid defensive posture. She worked with a frantic, desperate efficiency, her pale eyes darting toward the stairs every few seconds. She was a woman driven by a familiar frontier fear, the terror of being seen as an idle mouth to feed a burden easily discarded before the heavy snow locked the valley down. Caleb descended the creaking wooden stairs slowly, deliberately stepping into her line of sight so as not to startle her. Even so, Hannah jumped slightly when he appeared, her hand instinctively clutching the spoon to her chest as she backed off the crate. She bowed her head, standing at attention, like a soldier waiting for a reprimand. Caleb did not scold her. He walked to the stove, took a tin mug from the shelf, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He pointed to the pot of oats, then rubbed his own stomach, offering a single firm nod of approval. Hannah stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any hidden mockery. Finding none, the sharp tension in her jaw relaxed by a fraction of an inch. She stepped back onto the crate and resumed stirring. They ate breakfast in complete silence across the heavy oak table. Caleb watched her out of the corner of his eye. Hannah ate quickly, her eyes fixed entirely on her bowl, keeping her ears attuned to the vibrations of the floorboards. When she finished, she immediately gathered the dirty bowls, carried them to the basin, and began scrubbing them with cold water and lye soap. Caleb put on his heavy sheepskin coat and leather work gloves. He tapped the wooden table to catch her attention, then gestured toward the front door. Hannah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her thin cotton shawl, wrapping it tightly around her head, and followed him out into the biting morning air. The work on a mountain ranch was relentless, and Caleb did not coddle her. He gave her a galvanized tin bucket filled with cracked corn and pointed toward the chicken coop near the barn. He then grabbed a pitchfork and headed into the stables to muck out the heavy pine stalls. An hour later, Caleb finished with the horses and walked out to inspect the yard. He found Hannah sitting on an overturned bucket near the side of the barn. The chickens were fed, the water trough was cleared of ice, and her assigned chores were complete. But she was not resting. She was sitting in the freezing shadows, holding a small metallic object in her bare, reddened hands, her thumb rubbing its worn surface over and over again. She was weeping a silent, shoulder-shaking sorrow that produced no sound in the cold air. Caleb approached cautiously, deliberately, scuffling his heavy boots against the frozen gravel, so the vibrations would warn her. Hannah gasped, looking up in terror. She frantically wiped her cheeks with her sleeve and tried to shove the object into her apron pocket, but her freezing fingers fumbled. The metallic piece slipped from her grasp and tumbled into the dirt at Caleb's feet. Caleb knelt his knees, cracking in the frost, and picked it up. It was a heavy brass pocket watch deeply dented along its outer casing and attached to a faded blue silk ribbon. He pressed the release catch. The lid popped open, revealing a tintype photograph of a stern, dark-eyed man in a Union Army cavalry uniform. Tucked behind the photograph was a small piece of parchment folded with meticulous care. Caleb carefully unfolded the brittle yellowed paper. It was an official military commendation, age-stained, but legible in the winter sunlight. Captain Thomas Thorne, 1st Montana Cavalry, awarded for exceptional valor and unyielding devotion to duty at the Battle of Honey Springs. Caleb stared at the elegant, spidery script. He knew of Honey Springs. It was a brutal, rain-drenched clash where a handful of rearguard cavalrymen had held a muddy creek bed against impossible odds, so the division's supply wagons and field hospital could escape. Captain Thomas Thorne had been an officer of iron will. Caleb looked up at the deaf young woman shivering in the mountain wind. This was not a nameless charity case he had bought for $2 on a livery block. She was the bloodline of an officer, a hero's granddaughter, cast adrift in an unforgiving territory that saw only her silence. Caleb carefully refolded the document and tucked it back behind the tintype photo. He snapped the watch casing shut. He did not offer her pity. He knew, from the sharp set of her jaw, that pity would feel like an insult. Instead, Caleb looked her directly in the eye, held out the watch, and gave her a crisp, formal military salute. Hannah's pale eyes widened in shock. She understood the gesture instantly. She took the watch with trembling fingers, her chin lifting high. The tears stopped immediately. "Come on," Caleb said softly, knowing she couldn't hear the words, but needing to speak them anyway. "We need to get you a coat before the sky falls." An hour later, Caleb hitched his team of draft horses to the supply wagon and drove Hannah into Pine Creek. The town was buzzing with activity as mountain folks made their final trips before the high passes froze over. Caleb parked the team outside Maud Gable's general store and motioned for Hannah to follow him inside. The store was warm-smelling of peppermint dried apples and raw wool. Behind the counter stood Maud Gable, a sharp-eyed woman whose tongue was as sharp as her ledger pencils. "Caleb Vance," Maud said, looking up over her spectacles. Her gaze shifted instantly to Hannah standing behind Caleb's shoulder. "I heard the rumors from the placement fair. So you actually threw away $2 on Silas Finch's broken stock. I need a heavy winter coat for my ward," Caleb said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "And a pair of fleece-lined leather boots, size 6. Maud sniffed, coming around the counter with a measuring tape. She approached Hannah the way one might approach an unpredictable animal. "She doesn't speak a word, does she?" Maud asked loudly, raising her voice as if volume could cure deafness. "Just stares at a person. It isn't natural, Caleb. A young woman living out at your cabin all alone. Folks in town are already talking about the propriety of it." Before Caleb could answer, the bell above the door chimed, and Jed Buck, a heavy-set ranch hand, with a reputation for cruelness, stomped into the store. He carried a 100-pound sack of flour over his broad shoulder. Seeing Hannah, Jed grinned nastily and slammed the heavy sack onto the wooden counter directly behind her with a thunderous crash, expecting her to jump out of her skin. Hannah didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, looked at the flour dust settling on the floorboards, and then raised her eyes to meet Jed's with a freezing, unbothered indifference. Jed's grin vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl. "Creepy little mute," he muttered, stepping closer to her space. "Needs to learn some manners." Caleb shifted. He didn't raise his fists, but his entire frame locked into an ominous, lethal stillness. He stepped directly between Jed Buck and Hannah, his chest blocking the larger man's path. "Buck," Caleb said. His voice was quietly dangerous, like iron dragging over stone. "You have business in this store, finish it. Then step away from my ward." Jed looked into Caleb's cold, deadpan eyes and saw a man who had nothing left to lose. Raising his hands in a mock surrender, Jed backed away toward the door and slipped out into the street. Maud Gable returned with a thick, dark navy wool coat and a pair of sturdy, fleece-lined boots. Hannah put them on. The coat fit her broad shoulders perfectly, wrapping her in genuine warmth for the first time in months. Caleb laid the silver coins on the counter without a word, grabbed their packages, and walked toward the exit. As they stepped out onto the freezing boardwalk, Hannah stopped. She looked down at her new boots, then raised her face to Caleb. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out her gloved hand and firmly gripped the rough wool of his coat sleeve. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but as the iron-gray sky began to drop the first heavy flakes of a massive blizzard, it marked a quiet covenant between them. Within 3 hours of their return from Pine Creek, the sky over the Bitterroot Valley turned the brutal color of bruised iron. The temperature plunged 30 degrees in less than 60 minutes, the air thickening into a dense, suffocating gray. A wild, howling wind tore down from the mountain peaks, carrying with it a blinding, swirling wall of snow. It was a prairie-killer blizzard, the kind of sudden, merciless storm that froze cattle where they stood and erased the boundaries between earth and sky. Inside the cabin, the heavy timbers groaned under the assault. Caleb stood by the front window, watching the white darkness obliterate the tree line. His pulse hammered against his ribs. The pregnant heifers were still out in the lower pasture, huddled near the frozen creek bed. If they were trapped in the drifts overnight, he would lose half his herd before spring. Caleb turned, grabbing his heavy sheepskin coat and oilskin slicker from the wall pegs. Hannah sat at the kitchen table sewing a loose seam on her canvas apron. She stopped her needle, her eyes tracking his hurried, tense movements. Caleb walked over to her, putting a heavy hand on her shoulder. He pointed to her, then pointed firmly down at the floorboards of the cabin. "Stay here," he said, speaking slowly into her line of sight. He walked to the cast-iron stove, threw 3 thick logs of cured hickory onto the embers, and gestured again. "Keep the fire going. Do not come outside." Hannah stood up instantly. Ignoring his gestures, she marched straight to the door, grabbed her new navy wool coat, and pulled her fleece-lined boots onto her feet. Caleb caught her by the arm, shaking his head sharply. "No!" he mouthed, his face stern with panic. "It's too dangerous. Stay inside." Hannah stared back at him, her pale eyes blazing with an unyielding, fearless intensity. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her grandfather's dented brass pocket watch, and tapped the cold metal casing twice against her chest. She pointed a finger at Caleb, then at herself, giving him a sharp, uncompromising nod. She was a thorn. She was not a helpless ornament to be left by the hearth while he risked his life in the storm. Caleb looked at her stubborn jaw and realized he didn't have time to argue. The wind was already screaming through the log chinks. He turned to his workbench, grabbed a 50-foot coil of heavy hemp rope, and tied one end securely around his waist. He looped the other end tightly around Hannah's waist, knotting it twice. "Stay close!" Caleb shouted, knowing the roaring gale would swallow his voice entirely. Don't let go of the line. They stepped out into the whiteout. The impact of the wind was a physical blow, knocking the breath from Caleb's lungs. The cold was absolute razor-sharp, instantly freezing the moisture in his nostrils. Within 10 paces of the port, the cabin vanished behind them. The world became a deafening, swirling vortex of blinding white. In the blinding storm, Caleb was stripped of his primary senses. He could not see 5 feet ahead, and the deafening roar of the wind erased all sound, leaving him in a world of violent, chaotic white noise. For the first time in his life, Caleb Vance was as blind and deaf as the girl tied to his waist. Relying entirely on muscle memory and the slant of the icy terrain, Caleb forged ahead toward the lower pasture, dragging his feet through knee-deep drifts. Hannah followed close behind, her head bowed against the stinging frost, her hand gripping the taut rope between them. After 20 agonizing minutes, they reached the pasture fence. The heifers were clustered together against a stand of frozen pine trees, bellowing in terror, refusing to move. Caleb waded into the herd, shouting and waving his arms, trying to drive the shivering animals toward the safety of the main barn lane. Suddenly, a massive black heifer panicked. By a sudden gust of wind, bolted blindly through the drift, she slammed directly into Caleb's flank. Caleb stumbled sideways. His left boot caught on a jagged, ice-covered pine root hidden beneath the snow. His weight shifted violently, and a sickening, sharp crack echoed through his leg as his kneecap snapped out of alignment. A blinding, white-hot agony shot up Caleb's spine. He gasped, his vision swimming in red, and collapsed sideways into a deep snowbank. He tried to push himself up, but the moment he put pressure on his left leg, the ruined knee buckled, sending him headfirst back into the freezing drift. The wind howled louder, instantly filling his tracks with fresh snow. He was 300 yards from the cabin, trapped in sub-zero temperatures, unable to walk. The lethal cold began to seep through his sheepskin coat, numbing his hands and slowing his heart. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped Caleb's chest. He was going to freeze to death in this pasture, and because of his stubborn pride, he was going to take a 19-year-old girl down with him. Fumbling with frozen, clumsy fingers, Caleb reached for the knot at his waist. He tried to untie the rope, Hannah frantically gesturing for her to follow the fence line back to the house alone. Hannah knelt beside him in the snow. She saw his twisted leg, and the agonizing strain etched across his pale face. When she saw him trying to undo the knot, her hands shot forward and clamped over his wrists with surprising strength. She looked him straight in the eyes. There was no terror in her pale gaze, only the cool, analytical precision of a soldier assessing a battlefield. She stood up. She did not run for help. Instead, she turned her back to the blinding wind, closed her eyes, and stood perfectly still in the whiteout. Caleb watched her in dazed, feverish confusion. Hannah was doing the only thing she knew how to do. In a world where Caleb was rendered helpless by the storm's noise and darkness, Hannah was in her natural element. She had lived in absolute silence her entire life. She did not rely on her eyes or her ears to navigate the world. She relied on the physical weight of it, the subtle vibrations of the earth, and the tactile shifts in the wind. Standing in the storm, she felt the specific deep thrum of the wind striking the broad, solid timber wall of the main barn. She felt the subtle slope of the frozen creek bed against the soles of her boots. She opened her eyes. She pointed directly into the blinding wall of white to their left. Hannah bent down, grabbed Caleb by the thick wool collar of his coat, with both hands planted her fleece-lined boots into the snowdrifts and pulled. Caleb was a heavy man, but Hannah dug her heels into the frozen dirt and hauled him inch by agonizing inch through the drifts. Caleb tried to push with his good leg, gritting his teeth against the searing agony in his knee, but his strength was failing rapidly. His head drooped, his vision blurred around the edges. Hannah did not stop. She moved with a mechanical, relentless determination, step back, brace pull. She navigated by the subtle dips in the terrain that her feet memorized, hauling his weight through the freezing darkness until the wall of wind suddenly broke. They tumbled through the side latch door of the main barn. The roaring wind instantly faded into a muffled moan. Hannah dropped Caleb onto the soft, dry hay of the central aisle, collapsing beside him, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Caleb lay on his back, shivering violently, his skin gray with frostbite. But as he looked up at the girl kneeling over him in the dim stall light, a profound, shattering realization washed over him. For 5 years he had lived under the arrogant delusion that he was a protector, that he had bought a helpless deaf girl to save her from a cruel world. I was entirely wrong. He hadn't saved her. As she grabbed a utility knife from the workbench to slice open his frozen trousers and prepare pine board splints for his knee, Caleb knew the truth in the silence of the storm. She was the one saving him. By midnight, the fever took hold of Caleb Vance. He lay trapped in the shivering twilight of pneumonia, his cracked lips murmuring broken fragments of his lost daughter's name. His swollen left leg was immobilized between 2 sturdy pine boards bound tight with hemp twine, but the bone-deep chill had already settled into his chest. Beside him in the dim, straw-scented darkness of the barn stall, Samson, the heavy draft horse, stood motionless, radiating a gentle, life-saving heat. Hannah wrapped a thick canvas tarp over Caleb's upper body and pressed her warm, bare hands against his sunken cheeks, every hour monitoring the shallow rattle in his lungs. She knew that splinting his shattered knee was merely a temporary reprieve. Without a doctor, proper medicine, and warm broth, the bitter cold of the Montana Territory would claim his life before the sun crossed the Bitterroot Peaks. When the pale blue light of dawn finally broke, the storm had spent its fury, leaving a blinding sub-zero stillness over the valley. The snow drifts were piled 3 feet high against the barn's heavy oak doors. Hannah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a wide wooden shovel from the tool rack and dug furiously for an hour, clearing a narrow trench through the frozen crust. She led Samson out into the glaring white world. Having no saddle, she dragged an empty grain crate to the horse's side, climbed onto his broad back, and gripped his thick, braided mane. She looked back once at the silent barn where Caleb lay unconscious, then dug her heels into the draft horse's flanks, galloping hard into the unbroken drifts toward Pine Creek. The frontier town was just beginning to dig itself out from the blizzard when Hannah came riding down the main street. Snow flew from Samson's hooves as she pulled the heavy horse to a halt outside the small wooden clinic. She tumbled off the crate, slammed open the clinic door, and stumbled inside covered in frost, her face pale with exhaustion. Doc Samuel Evans, a gray-haired veteran, with a slight limp and a permanent scowl, dropped his tin mug of morning coffee in alarm. "Girl, what in heaven's name aren't you Caleb Vance's new ward?" Hannah ignored his words, running forward to grab the lapels of his heavy wool coat, yanking him violently toward the door. Hold on now!" Doc Evans barked, pulling back to stabilize himself. "I can't understand you. What's happened to Vance?" Hannah let go of his coat. She pointed frantically toward the northern trail, slammed her fist against her left knee, twisted her face into a mask of sharp agony, and then mimicked the heavy rattling cough of a dying man. Doc Evans' eyes widened with instant comprehension. He turned toward his medical shelf, grabbing his black leather bag and a bottle of carbolic salve. "Tucker Buck!" the doctor shouted into the street, beckoning 2 heavy-set men who were shoveling the boardwalk. "Get your logging sled hooked up. Caleb Vance is down at his homestead and his leg is smashed." An hour later, the logging sled crested the hill at the Vance Ranch. Doc Evans and the men found Caleb semi-conscious in the hay, burning with a violent lung fever. Working quickly, they lifted him onto the horse-drawn sled, wrapping him in heated blankets. Hannah sat beside him the entire 3-mile journey back to town, holding his freezing, calloused hand between her own, her pale eyes tracking every shift in the doctor's anxious expression. Inside the clinic, Doc Evans worked for 2 grueling hours under the yellow glare of kerosene lamps. He set the fractured knee, bound the torn ligaments in clean linen, and poured a warm herbal tincture down Caleb's throat to break the congestion in his chest. Throughout it all, Hannah stood motionless in the corner of the room, her back braced against the log wall, refusing to sit, drink, or leave his side. Finally, Doc Evans washed his hands in a tin basin and let out a long, weary sigh. "He'll make it," the doctor muttered, turning toward the quiet young woman. "He's as stubborn as an old mountain mule. He'll walk with a heavy cane for the rest of his days, but he's alive." Doc Evans walked over to Hannah, kneeling down slightly so he was at her eye level. He offered a gentle, reassuring smile and gave her a firm thumbs up. Hannah reached deep into her coat pocket. She pulled out the heavy brass pocket watch, opening the dented lid to reveal the tintype photograph and the yellowed parchment folded behind it. She held it out to the doctor, her expression sharp and solemn. She didn't want him or the town to view her as a stray animal they had pitied. She wanted them to know who she was and why she had fought so fiercely to save the man who had treated her with dignity. Doc Evans took the watch. He unfolded the brittle paper, reading the faded script, "Captain Thomas Thorne, 1st Montana Cavalry, Battle of Honey Springs." The doctor's face drained of all color. His hands began to tremble violently as he stared at the name. He sat back heavily on a wooden stool, his eyes brimming with sudden, unbidden tears. "Honey Springs," Doc Evans whispered, his voice cracking with old buried grief. "July of '63. The mud was up to our horses' bellies, and the Confederates had us pinned down at the creek crossing. We had 4 wagons of wounded men, and we were dead." He looked up at Hannah, his chest heaving. "Captain Thorne took 20 men and held that timber line for 40 minutes so the medical wagons could cross. He gave his life so 80 wounded soldiers could live. I was a 20-year-old surgeon's assistant in those wagons." Doc Evans stood up, slowly walked to the clinic door, and threw it wide open. A small crowd of townfolk, including Maud Gable and Jed Buck, had gathered on the boardwalk waiting for news on Caleb Vance. "Listen to me, all of you," Doc Evans announced, his voice echoing down the snowy street with absolute, unquestioned authority. "Caleb Vance is going to live because this young woman dragged him 300 yards through a whiteout blizzard, splinted his shattered leg, and rode a bareback horse through sub-zero drifts to fetch me." The crowd murmured in stunned disbelief. Maud Gable pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Her name is Hannah Thorne," Doc Evans continued, his eyes burning with pride. "Her grandfather was Captain Thomas Thorne, the man who laid down his life at Honey Springs, so I and half the veterans in this territory could come home to build this town. We stood on a livery block in November and let a hero's granddaughter be hawked for $2 like broken merchandise. We owe her a debt of honor this county can never repay." Silence fell over Pine Creek, not the ugly, dismissive silence of the auction block, but a quiet, profound reverence. Jed Buck slowly pulled off his wool hat, bowing his head in genuine shame, while Maud Gable stepped forward, placing her hand over her heart in a silent pledge of respect. Muaswin came to the Bitterroot Valley with a fierce, brilliant green. The mountain snows melted into roaring creeks, and the cattle grew fat on the sweet prairie grass. Caleb Vance sat on the front porch of his cabin, whittling a piece of soft pine with his pocket knife. His right leg was stiff, resting beside a heavy carved wooden cane, but his eyes were clear, and the hollow loneliness that had haunted his home for 5 years was entirely gone. The cabin now had bright calico curtains in the windows, a thriving vegetable garden near the barn, and laughter in its quiet spaces. Whenever they rode into Pine Creek for supplies, the townsfolk greeted them with warm waves and deep respect. Hannah walked out onto the porch carrying a basket of fresh eggs. She was 20 now, tall, her shoulders relaxed, moving with the quiet grace of a woman who knew she belonged to the land, and the land belonged to her. Caleb handed her the piece of pine he had been carving. It was a miniature, detailed figure of Samson, the draft horse. Hannah's face lit up with a brilliant smile. She traced the carved mane with her thumb, then looked up at Caleb. Using the silent language of gestures they had built together over the long winter, Hannah pointed to the carved horse, pointed to Caleb, and then brought both hands flat against her chest, right over her heart. Family. Caleb felt a deep, solid warmth spread through his chest. He reached out, pulling her into a rough, protective embrace. Family, he spoke aloud to the mountain wind. He had gone to town on a cold Tuesday for salt pork and flour, paying $2 for a deaf girl out of a sudden, quiet anger at a cruel world. But as they sat together, watching the sun dip behind the green peaks of Montana, Caleb knew the ultimate truth of his life. He hadn't bought a burden. He had been given a savior, and it was without a doubt the greatest $2 blessing a man had ever known.